Today's episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn Street. Dunn Street is a progressive campaign agency that specialises in campaigning and community organising. We work with non-profit and community-based organisations, trade unions, progressive businesses and social democratic parties across the globe. Dunn Street develops community engagement and organising strategies to win campaigns both big and small, and we train engagement staff, volunteers and organisers in leadership and power building. And we also work with leaders that want to craft their own public narrative that can tell a story that unites people and moves them to act together. If you want to create change in your community, then hit us up at dunstreet.com.au. Today's episode is also brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. When you need support with a legal issue, it can feel rather daunting. And that's why for over 100 years, Maurice Blackburn has been helping clients guide them through their legal needs. They're here to help when you need them the most, from workplace to medical injuries, class actions, occupational diseases, and wills and estates planning. And as Australia's leading plaintiff law firm, they have the local knowledge and the national network with experience that you can count on. And to find out more, simply go to mauriceblackburn.com.au. And finally, today's episode is brought to you by SwiftFox. Every moment on a campaign matters. You need the tools that you can trust, lists that are up to date, phone banks that can change minds, emails that drive donations, events that will energise the community online and offline, and text blasts that distill your message perfectly. SwiftFox CRM is made for campaigners by campaigners, and to find out more, you can visit their website, which is swiftfoxcrm.com, to win your next campaign. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left politics and organising podcast that is out every Friday that dives into the progressive campaigns of the day and the people leading them from home and abroad. And we are going to be talking to a good friend of mine. She's the former Assistant Secretary of the Australian Labor Party Western Australia branch, and she now does wonderful things over in WA with different communities. But at the heart of it all, she is a Labor person, and she is an organiser. She's an organiser, I should say. Her name is Lenda Oshalem. We've had Lenda on the podcast a couple of times. You may remember her from our election night coverage that we did with Week on Wednesday, where we spoke to Lenda as the polls were closing and the counts were coming in from Western Australia. That wonderful result that we got in the West that brought home the Albanese government. But having Lenda on the show that night was fantastic, because just the pure joy and excitement as she was reading count sheets from seats that no one expected Labor to win was a thing of joy. Should be in the Smithsonian in the United States. But she's not. She's here with us today because what we're going to do is she was on the review of the election campaign, the federal election campaign last year. Her and a number of other colleagues, Linda White, I think was one of the others, were on the review, and Lenda's on the show today to talk about the federal campaign review. What went well and why, and what didn't go well and what we can do differently next time. What are the lessons that have come out of this campaign? Because there are always lessons in every one of our campaigns, whether we win or lose. And I don't know if people had a chance to read the review. So if you haven't, what better way than just get someone who wrote the review on the show to talk a bit about that. So I'm looking forward to that conversation today with Lenda Oshalem. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify and Stitcher. And if you like the show, be sure to give us 5 stars on Apple Podcast and on Spotify when you're done listening to the episode, or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. And for all of the updates, follow Dunn Street on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and LinkedIn. All right, let's get to today's episode. We are taping this one on a Friday morning on the lands of the Wurundjeri people. And I've been meaning to do this episode for a while now, and time just keeps on slipping by, but we got here eventually. Good things come to those who wait, as my mother always said. Joining on the line from Perth, Western Australia, the People's Republic of Perth. A good friend of mine, an old organiser buddy of mine, Lenda Oshalem. Welcome back to Socially Democratic.
Hey, yeah. Thanks for having me.
Last time you and I spoke, actually we did, I think it was like a post May election analysis And then the time before that was you were on our live telecast as the results were literally like a waterfall of wonderful results were washing over you from Perth as Labor just cleaned up.
Yeah.
So it's always good to talk to you about this sort of stuff. Good memories, as always. But two reasons why I want to talk to you on today's episode. One, you're a part of the National Campaign Review that happened after our emphatic victory, along with Greg Combet, Craig Emerson, and Senator Linda White into the 2022 federal election campaign. And also, it's sort of 12 months. Well, it's actually now more than 12 months. It just shows you how long I've been trying to do this episode since Labor was returned to the government benches. So I kind of want to have a bit of a yak with you about what did you see in the review? Because sometimes when we win these elections and we do these campaign reviews, they can be a bit of a sort of a, the positivity can paper over some of the cracks, and not all campaigns are perfect. There's no such thing as a perfect campaign. Although the 2018 Victorian campaign will go pretty close.
Well, WA 2017, WA
exactly.
2021.
That's the problem, isn't it, right?
Yeah.
We're so goddamn good at this at the moment. But yeah, so I even though that we did win, there still was a review, and I think it's important for our listeners to hear from someone who was on the review to get a bit of an insight into what came out of it. So I wanted to do that first off, and then the second half of the show, I wanted to spend time just talking about how the Albanese government's going. So before we do that, how did you get roped? So let's talk about the review. How did you get roped into that? Because it's not like you don't get paid for this. It's for the love of the party. It does take a lot of time. It's a lot of a national campaign review as well, right? A lot of conversations. I'm assuming, well, back in the old days, it would have been a lot of flights around the country, but with Zoom these days, maybe that probably don't need to do as much of that, but still a lot of conversations with a lot of people across all the branches, right?
Yeah, very manageable this time. I can say that. I remember I was at Patrick Gorman's election night party as 6 o'clock had ticked over in the eastern states. And it was about an hour or so later and we started to see results coming in. And I remember just sort of like, the early stages of the results that we got, it was just sprayed everywhere. And it was all very, starting to get, very early on 2019 vibes, and we're starting to get a little worried. I remember just turning around to my partner and to Patrick saying, I'd really like to look at this result for the party. I think there's a lot of really important stuff and lessons that we're going to need to take away from this election. About an hour later, I was sculling a beer on your live cast, celebrating how wonderful Western Australia is yet again. So it was, but it was good, and I remember saying that. And I think it's a great honour to do reviews for the party, and I am deeply grateful for the opportunity too, because I think it's really important work, and what an opportunity to just take a quick moment to just acknowledge the high caliber people I was doing the review with: Greg Combet, Linda White, Craig Emerson, but also the folks at National Office, Bryden Toner, Matilda Stevenson, Jen Light, and Paul Erickson, who were amazing throughout the process. They were so thoughtful as well, and considered and open and deliberate about the intent of this review. This wasn't about writing up a piece that said, and we won, it's all great. It was actually intended to look at the results, the varying degree of success or otherwise in some of those pockets of jurisdictions across pockets across the country. And so we did about 90 interviews. We received over 100 submissions. We talked to kind of key cabinet ministers, state premiers and territory leaders, state branches, key people from the National Secretariat CHQ team. We also ran a research program, and I think this is a credit to the National Office for investing in this post-election research, but we ran 30 focus groups across the country just to understand some of the motivations of sort of key voter groups and categories, and found some really important findings, matched it with some data analysis, and sort of poured over the result in detail and released a report. We by no means shied away from some of the challenges that were experienced throughout the campaign and some of the kind of core results. And so it was kind of like really important piece of work. My biggest fear was I knew this report was going to come out in the afternoon, and you know how the universities do a post-election study?
Yeah.
Theirs came out that morning,
Oh.
and my biggest fear was like we put something out that just was not at all embedded in the reality of what the data would say from the universities. But it was quite good in that we were very aligned in terms of our findings and key inputs. But yeah, it's an important piece of work. Do you want me to talk a little bit about some of those?
Well, yeah, I mean, I've got some questions around some of the recommendations that I do want to ask you later, but I'd like for you to first of all just kind of give us a bit of an overview of, what came out of the review. What were the things that stood out to you that were interesting, or what were some of the things that would you take with you into if you were to go run another campaign, which won't be that far away, really, when you think about
Yeah.
it. These are the things you would take into that campaign and go, right, this is something we need to learn from last time.
Oh, absolutely. At its core, I think there's a couple of things that should be called out. So our report encourages taking that kind of longer term view, and um, laying the sort of a platform for a long term government, right? So we should encourage people to foster discipline and focus and a commitment to the kind of values driven, stable, respectful government honors and delivers its commitments, and thinks about how it could be delivering on an agenda that kind of you know bridges the divide on climate policy, bridges the divide between jurisdictions, has an eye to the regions as well as the outer suburban areas, and inner city areas. Thinks about how to rebuild support in our heartland areas and unite people in the middle suburban, communities to kind of build winning combination, of servicing and advocating and delivering for people all across Australia. And I think um, that's a kind of like key message out of the report, is to have an eye to that, and to think about being deliberate in every single day of being in government and in every single day of being a party of government, how we keep that stuff front and center, in the lead up, not just to the next election but to the ones thereafter as well. So that's kind of the big summation of the thing, and then there's obviously a lot of little recommendations to kind of pour after that, build towards that overarching objective.
You've covered off a whole bunch of big things there. So let's start to unpack some of those things. Did one of the narratives that came out of the campaign was that Labor didn't get elected, the government got unelected,
Mm.
that Morrison was toxic. But I think both things can be true. Labor can get elected and the government can get unelected, right? You still
Mm.
have to be a viable alternative. Um, what did the review find in respect to that question? Were there areas where there were things that resonated with voters that Labor was saying, whilst at the same time people were turned off by Morrison or more broadly a tired government?
Yeah, absolutely. The key to understanding sort of what happened and how this at it, this what this is was a Labor victory, is to understand the strategy adopted by you and I will sing his praises till the cows come home. But Paul Erickson, as a national director, drove a really strong, disciplined show, and he developed a strategy for success, a strategy for winning that focused on um, highlighting um, the failures of Morrison and his government, and creating a space to keep the focus on his issues where he'd been failing at, whether it's the sort of emergency response, where the pandemic, response to the pandemic at certain stages, the sex scandals in Parliament, all of that sort of, really deeply felt, highly emotional issues that where he failed, where he let people down, creating a space to kind of share that story and make sure it's known and let them be highlighted, throughout the campaign is kind of an important part of the strategy. And then what it also then meant was like sort of point two was to kind of minimise the scope of negative attacks on Labor and Labor's policy agenda, which is actually very strategic and very different from the 2019 experience. So I also was part of the panel that reviewed the 2019 federal election, and we took a very ambitious agenda to the election, and to some people it was scary in the community. To some people that was something that they probably weren't ready to jump all in on, right? And to be attuned to that, in an environment that was experiencing at 2022 significant change through experiencing the pandemic, the emergence of more disasters and emergencies all across the country, and environmental impacts kind of becoming this kind of growing concern for people. The last thing you want to do is scare them about the expected change that could come from their vote, unless they were seeking it. What they were seeking in terms of what was really effective from the strategy, and there could be no doubt about this, was that they needed a change in the tone of government and the approach of government. And so one of the downsides of that, and I'm sure we'll talk about it, is that there's probably less awareness of Labor's platform going into the election, and what the impact of that might end up being. The low, may have had the impact on having the low primary. And we'll talk about that in a second. But essentially, what it meant was that people would be making a decision. There could be no doubt that Morrison's, unpopularity was a significant factor at this election. But once they decided, I saw this as a little flowchart. Once they decided that they didn't want Morrison, they would look around to see, well, who do we want? And they'd either vote Labor at that point, or they'd keep looking to go, well, I'm not really sure what their position is or what the platform is, or I'm not really sure I'm a Labor voter as such. And they'll keep looking around. The next layer of what they look for is in their local member, whether that's somebody who is an advocate for them, no matter the political party they represent, someone who works hard, someone who advocates for them. They look for that. And if they didn't see that, then their vote sort of sprayed anywhere else, right? It was whether it was a single issue or something they could, something they care about particularly, and they had a party that they recognise had a strong stance of it in that on that issue. In that flow chart, our opportunity was to maximise, the awareness of Morrison's unpopularity, and be there to position that kind of safe cradle, safe alternative, stable alternative that people can switch to. So it's a bit of both, but there can be no doubt that the Morrison factor was a big contributor to the result.
Let's talk about the primary.
Yeah.
It was the lowest it has been since 1934. And even in the most recent Victorian state election, Labor's primary was low, yet increased our majority in the parliament, in the lower house, by an additional seat. So I think sometimes, I only point that out just because I think sometimes we can get a little bit obsessed about the primary. And to your point there, people went shopping. They were like, I'm definitely not voting for the Tories, but I'm still not 100% certain about Labor. So I'm going to go for a bit of a wander and have a look and where I'm going to put my first preference. And clearly, people did put their preferences on the heads of other types of candidates before they came home to Labor, and enough of them did that to get us over the line. What did you see from what things impacted on our primary being so low in this particular campaign that we could address going forward into the next election?
Oh, absolutely. So I'll just reiterate. In the scheme of things, this was a really, really great election result, right? Because of the circumstances, right? Troubled economy, rising rates and inflation, Ukraine, pandemic, general discontent and disruption. In that mix, in that mess, in that muddied communications environment, to come through to be a party from opposition to government is a really significant and important outcome. And it's a great result, and let's just start there.
And Linda, can I add to that as well? And also, unifying the
Yeah,
federal caucus because it's like herding cats. And I say
yeah,
that with love, you know? I think it's a lot easier to sort of coalesce a state caucus,
yeah,
but a national caucus, this is a big country and
yeah,
we are diverse in our own kind of homogenous way. And trying
yeah.
to get all these people on the same path is not an easy task. So to do that as well, I think is quite remarkable. So yes, continue.
Totally, and actually that plays into like uh, knowing that also plays into that result too, right? Like, so there's this old, it's the old book, The Professionals, right? It's written by Stephen Mills, and it talks about how labor organisers, how the two major party, Labor and Liberal Party, organised their campaigns, and there was this sort of, I'm going to get this wrong because it's been a while since I read it, but I used to use this example quite often, right? There used to be a communications environment or an election environment where you could, have a leader say something in Brisbane and then have them turn up to Bunbury in Western Australia and say something sort of different, and it would be okay. It's not something you could get away with anymore, where you could sort of talk to a specific jurisdiction in a way that doesn't sort of pose a risk to the overall national campaign approach, your messaging, etc. To be able to have and foster a difference of opinion across the country, right? And
Yeah.
so the Labor Party went and created a national office to sort of remedy this emerging challenge, so that people were more sort of centralized, unified in terms of being able to kind of like avoid distractions and disruptions during election campaigns. The Liberal Party tried to copy it, but kind of um, couldn't quite match the success of how Labor was able to deliver it, right? And I think over time, and this is entirely a personal opinion, I think over time we became in the Labor Party a bit too obsessed with um, everyone stay on message, everyone say the same thing, everyone make sure that there's one national campaign that runs without, and we became too obsessed with it that we forgot that you do have to kind of nuance your approach into each individual state, and then again within individual communities. And that doesn't mean you have to have a strategy that sprays everywhere or that you're saying completely wildly different things, but just being attuned to community sentiment, and that it would be different in New South Wales or Victoria compared to Western Australia is quite critical. It was one of the reasons for success of this campaign, was that yes, we had an overarching national strategy, but we also had a national strategy and a national campaign director who gave the ability to state branches and to to individual communities, which I'll talk about in a second, but to who gave them the ability to kind of take the overarching objective and then apply how they would work out it would work within their community. Because yeah, we aren't the same across the country. WA's felt this acutely. I'm sure it happens in every state, right? And you feel this acutely around needing something a little bit more tailored, a little bit more bespoke. And I think that sort of overcorrection from a couple of years ago has been adjusted at the last election, and I think that makes a difference in terms of fostering that unity. But to go to that kind of point around, what are the things that contribute to that low primary that you could address for the future, right? So um, I think there's that big overarching, right? So what's a significant contributor to improving the primary? It's managing the economy well, delivering on your election commitments, putting the interests of working people first, delivering on wages growth, addressing cost of living, housing affordability, protecting Medicare, da da da. Like being good government
Mm.
and being really decent at having a crack at fixing some big challenges and delivering on a vision for the country is going to make the biggest of all differences. Being a stable, sensible, disciplined government would make the biggest difference to improving the primary. But we also think, at a very practical level, it is also about being an active local community servant as a member of parliament, putting the priorities of your community first and foremost. Like none of being in government is possible without members of parliament representing their communities passionately,
Mm.
right? That's what makes a government. And I think that is something that would go a long way to also addressing the primary, being able to be cognizant of that kind of, it is a bit of a long term trend that major parties have been losing support. When you and I started delivering training to our, young Labor comrades, 10, 15 years ago, we used to say about 45%, 40% of the electorate votes Labor, 40% of the electorate votes Liberals, about 20% we're all going after. The reality is that every year on year after that, when we were delivering the training, we kept saying it got lower and lower. I remember in WA getting to a point where I was saying, it's probably about 30% for the Liberal Party, it's probably about 20% for the Labor Party, and it's everyone else we're going after. And that was back in 2014, 2015. So there is a bit of a long-term trend around major parties not being able to kind of like bank a certain proportion of the vote going into an election. That doesn't mean the major parties have lost the ability of being parties of government, or that there's some massive dramatic drive in wanting to see an independent become the prime minister, right? Much to some independents disliking, I would imagine. But what it does mean is that you do have to work harder at convincing a community about supporting your policies and supporting your proposals, and having faith in you to be a new government. I often compare this to the decline in volunteerism in community. Just because it's less likely that people will contribute their time like they used to be the presidents, secretaries, and treasurers of their local cricket club. It doesn't mean that local cricket clubs don't have a part to play and that they're very important. To the overall fabric of our community, right? So at the end of the day, being able to engage people differently and being able to engage them on a level where they can contribute how they want to will make a difference, right? And so it's just that thing that's changing that we need to be attuned to and respond to when we're running election campaigns.
There's a couple of points I want to pick up that you mentioned there around the primary. Do you think that I feel like to your analogy, or the story you gave about when we were younger and we talk about how 40%, the bedrock of the Labor primary was 40%. Sam Dastyari said to me going into what was the New South Wales election when they lost government? Was that 2011? 11? Yeah. He said, we're about to find how loyal the Labor Party base vote is right now, because we've been a terrible government. Like he said, is the last days of Rome. People are just naked and just throwing grapes into each other's mouths and drinking wine and stuff. And this is a disaster, right?
Yeah.
And we're about to find out exactly what is the bottom of our vote, right? I think it was like 24% primary. No matter how bad they were, 23% of the New South Wales population still gave a 1 to the Labor candidate. Back in the sort of 60s, 70s, 80s, the Labor primary was in the 40s. It held up around in the 40s. I guess what's happened in the sort of with the onset of third parties and independents is the softness of the Labor base has increased, but it kind of don't you think it expands and contracts depending on the electoral cycle that we're in? Like the Labor primary in the 2018 campaign for Victoria was, high fought. It was in the, 43, 44, right? It won't always hold there, but we're sort of seeing this sort of ebb and flow of our primary. And to your point, if we are a good government, the next time we go back to the polls, I would imagine that the Labor primary at a federal level will be nudging 40. I think that if Albanese and the team do a great job, voters will go, because there's going to be a whole bunch of people out there in the suburbs of Melbourne and Sydney and Perth and Brisbane and whatnot will just go, I'm just going to vote for the winners. There's this sort of no dickhead policy that the way that our voters behave. They're like, you've done a good job. All right, I'm happy with that. I'll give you my vote. I didn't last time, but you get my primary this time, And we see that primary lift again. I don't know if there's a question there, but that's
no. I think you're spot on, right? I think you're absolutely spot on, and that's So there was like during the review press, there was just a lot of this is dire, the thing has changed. There was that, I remember that feeling on the night, that I was like, what has, is this an irreversible change? Is this like the newest trend? Everyone's sending through Thomas Piketty stuff and like Trump stuff and Boris Johnson, like, you've got to read this. This is like all part of a global trend. And I hear it. I don't dismiss it at all in any way, shape or form. I get it. There's something going on out there. But I don't think it's insurmountable, and I don't think it's about it's changed forever and that's that, right? Like, because And I guess that's the kind of like the great hope of what I've experienced in WA. For me, just sort of says like actually being decent government, um, being able to put those, being able to do really good things for vulnerable people, while also keeping an eye on what are kind of like more mainstream issues, and issues that affect people, people in the kind of not, middle suburban areas, matters just as much, right? But being able to kind of balance all of the needs, but being able to kind of be attuned to where community sentiment is at, means for me that it's not an insurmountable. It's not like the biggest thing that's ever happened, and now politics has changed forever in Australia. I don't believe it. I believe that. And I find, this is the thing that I love the most about Australia and Australians, right? Well, by and large, are pretty easygoing people.
Mm.
We don't think that our governments are going to fix every single significant problem that we're all facing, but we'd like to see them have a go.
Mm.
And we like to back anyone who's having a go, right?
Mm.
And there's a degree of pragmatism and, really kind of just like kind of, yeah, there's just that degree of pragmatism about what can a politician or a government fix versus what do I expect them to be doing? How do I want them to turn up to their job? And so I just think that if you bring an attitude of an interest in community, and that's where putting community interest first, whether that's our own community, ALP membership, right? Our volunteers and their interests and what they want to see out of governments, multicultural communities, CULT communities, being able to understand, that they're not one big homogenous community and that they're actually different, different ethnicities, different background, different communities of interest on their own accord, and stop sort of treating people like mugs in, in heartland seats where, we may have sort of taken them again as one big homogenous. They're just like one big, wonderful Labor voting group, but they're not. They're actually like individual communities and people with their own interests and issues that might have a shared view about what they expect to see from their governments and their politicians, but they have different things they care about and they have different ways to be engaged with. And that sort of fundamental of respecting that difference, being attuned to it, being able to understand and respond to it in a way that matters to them and not to you, not that is convenient to you, but one that is convenient and super useful and helpful to them, I think just makes you a winner. Like, and as difficult and as simple as both that statement sounds, I think it's incredibly achievable. Like being respectful of people. Yep, we can all do that, right? And that's why I don't think there's this big break of like politics has changed forever. I just think we've now got to be more waking up about the fact that people I know are paying attention.
Yeah.
And it means that what was noticed decades ago around being consistent on policy views, no matter where you were across the country, is now just getting sort of deeper and deeper and deeper into communities. You can't go to the northern suburbs of Perth and say something different to the southern suburbs of Perth. But you can be attuned to different issues that are playing out in the area and how you would fix it by staying true to your values, staying true to how your values will be practically applied through policy and through engagement across communities.
Let's unpack some of the recommendations. I'm going to pick out a couple, but if there are other ones that you want to speak to, then I encourage you to do so. But I'm kind of going to go in order. Recommendation 8. By the way, folks, this is available on the Labor Party's national website. It's a public document, so we're not going through anything here that's sort of secret sauce. Recommendation 8 says Labor's research program over the next term should involve a broader cross-section of the Australian electorate and in particular soft Labor voters. And voters from a range of different demographic and localities should continue to be included in Labor's qualitative and quantitative research. When I read that, I sort of thought, aren't we doing this already?
Mm-hmm. Sort of.
Well, I can't speak from a federal but national campaign perspective, but I certainly know in 2018 in Victoria, we put in a lot of effort into say, hey, can we start to watch the people that are already in our camp to make sure that we don't lose them?
Hmm.
And so we were doing that, and I just assumed that was then happening across the country, but maybe that wasn't the case.
So it is, and it isn't. So it at some point, I think, like you've been in election campaigns just as much as I have. At some point, you're in the middle of it, and your track is set, and so you're sort of just watching the seats in the track, or you're watching your target seats, and there isn't this sort of mind to go, hey, what's happening elsewhere, right? Because you're just kind of in it at that point. There are some indications possibly early on that you should probably, be, conscious of what's happening or unique dynamics in one seed over another, etc. And so you probably test some stuff really early, but then being able to kind of like have that morph into um, having that degree of flexibility throughout the campaign, the intensity of the campaign period is difficult. You and I have experienced that before. I can tell you now, in 2013 in the state election in WA, where we went backwards, the most my heart sank, and I would never forget the feeling where we were calling up the pendulum, right? And we were like, okay, that one's gone. Okay, that one's gone. This is on election night, and we're just checking in with the teams on the ground. And I will never forget this feeling, right? And then we just sort of stopped, and we started back at the top of the pendulum and started working our way down.
Oh God.
And I just remember that kind of like pens down. There was three, four of us in a room. All right, let's get to the safest seat and start working our way down. We've got to work out how bad this thing is, right?
Mm.
But had you told me 2 or 3 weeks prior that I needed to be attuned to something that was happening in a 9% seat at the time, which, in my head, I was sort of looking at the sixes and down, right? I would have said that would be ridiculous, right? Because I had no indication to say to me that I had to go and look there.
Yeah.
Um, and I guess what we're saying in this recommendation is don't forget to keep looking.
Yeah.
And that's really important, as I said, because communities are different. People are paying attention. Expectations of how to be engaged and what their expectations are of governments and politics is different than it was 20 years ago. And so don't forget to keep looking is an important part. Now, there are some things in this in this report and in this recommendation that are more about actually acknowledging some of the improvements that National Secretariat and Paul Erickson have put in place at this last election, which was around doing some pretty good research into multicultural communities, right? And doing that in language, which is hell impressive, right? That we have, we have a campaign director who has finally kind of like woken up to not, we have a national secretariat. The campaign director was aware of it, but the national secretariat has finally woken up to the fact that census is saying multicultural communities make up more than half the population of Australia. Maybe we should take some time to have some stuff in language where we better understand the sentiment of that population. And that was done, and that's amazing, and we should continue to do that. There's this emergence of sort of three-corner contests. Now, Victoria's been doing this stuff, standing on its head since, whenever. When did you guys start worrying about three-corner contests, Stephen?
Oh, 2010, I would say.
Right? Like, and for others, maybe it's like a bit of a new thing, and maybe we all need to be a little bit more attuned to this is an emerging new thing around. There could be a really prominent third candidate that could emerge with a high recognition rating, and a well-resourced, a significantly well-resourced campaign backed by whoever, right? Because everyone's getting involved in politics now. And so we probably just want to be aware of like, what could that do in a seat? And let's research that and better understand, how do you have a conversation when there are three options instead of two? And what's your pitch about the third? And how do you sort of explain and talk about the importance of a first preference or a second preference vote to voters that barely pay attention to this stuff at the best of times, right? Like about the hypothetical of where do you put a number two on the ballot paper. So I guess the kind of the premise of this recommendation is to kind of like take the good things that did happen, take the pockets of good stuff like what Victoria's been doing since, 2010, getting ready and prepared for. Well, Queensland's been doing it. Queensland did it with the One Nation emergence of the One Nation vote over a period of time. So just taking some of that good work and pockets of good work across the country and applying it to that national setting, and being cognizant of not kind of getting into the hole during a campaign period and looking further afield just to sense check and make sure things are fine is going to be critical going forward.
Let's take a quick break to talk about SwiftFox. Every moment on a campaign matters. You need the tools that you can trust. Lists that are up to date, absolutely. Phone banks that can change minds. Emails that drive donations, and events that will energize the community online and offline. And text blasts that distill your message perfectly. SwiftFox CRM is made for campaigners by campaigners. And to find out more, go to swiftfoxcrm.com to win your next campaign. Okay, let's get back to the show. This next recommendation actually is a whopper. So I reckon you probably almost do a whole podcast on this, but recommendation 6, specific plans should be developed to address voter dissatisfaction in parts of outer suburban Melbourne and parts of Western Sydney, improve outcomes for federal Labor in Queensland, Labor's underperformance in Tasmania, and the retention of seats gained in Western Australia. So, i.e., it sounds like next time, don't lose here, and here, and try and win here, and here. Like, that is a huge recommendation, right?
Yeah, totally. But it goes back, I mean, it goes back to that. Like I'll give you the WA example again. You're probably going to stop inviting me to your podcast because all I do is talk about how wonderful Western Australia is, but it is wonderful. But if you think about, again, that kind of the national campaign, it's all about a better future. That was the kind of overarching message. In WA, there were some pretty unique factors in the lead up to the last federal election. First of all, the absolute incredible popularity of the local leader, Mark McGowan, who I've praised on this podcast before and will praise until my dying days, the most successful politician in our history. Went out on an absolute high 2 weeks ago. I cannot understate the significance, the importance of his role here in Western Australia and his ability to kind of like endorse Labor and to attract people to the Labor Party who've not thought about voting Labor, and he's done it now for a couple of terms, a couple of elections, which is incredible. So there's that factor. There was the incredible, can I swear?
Yeah.
Fuck up of the Clive Palmer saga and the position that the Liberal Party took in backing him initially was like they had turned their backs on Western Australia. And Western Australians felt that deeply, very deeply, because they picked the state over anything else, right? And the fact that the federal Liberal government decided to back Clive Palmer in his case against Western Australia, was a great sign of disloyalty. And so these two things had to be capitalised on during the election campaign. Now, the way it was done, and it's a huge credit to our fellow comrade Tim Picton and Ellie Whittaker, who's now State Secretary in WA. Amazing, formidable team. I've praised them before. Will continue to praise them for the rest of my life. They took that. They made the campaign in WA around Stand Up for WA, and highlighting the issue around Clive Palmer. Now, they didn't do that. If you look at the materials and if you look at the messaging, none of that was terribly inconsistent with the national approach. It's just that it highlighted and leveraged the right spokespeople or the right imagery or the right sort of a slight adjustment in language that really amplified that kind of uniqueness of what was happening in WA at the time. Now, again, nationally consistent with the strategy. Now, if that is something, so, don't lose here, and here is spot on, but it means more than pay attention. It means more than that. It means to pay attention to what's happening. Like we've got to talk about what we need to do in Tasmania, different from what we need to do in Queensland, different in what we need to do from three-cornered contests. And I think it's just a little bit about waking up to again, we just can't run one thing everywhere. We don't need to be inconsistent. We just need to be attuned to the specifics of what's happening or the circumstances in a jurisdiction to be able to really capitalize on selling ourselves well and being able to show people what a Labor government's doing in an area without sort of losing sight of some of the local issues or local context. So it is more about having plans that are overall consistent with the national campaign and the national objectives, but being attuned to those community things. And I guess that's the recommendations, just saying don't forget to do that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, then we can start to unpack that, because maybe some of the solutions are lined up in some of the recommendations further down in the document. Recommendation 12. For the benefit of embedding a culture of continuous campaigning and fundraising, Labor should continue re-establishing a caucus communications committee. Actually, I'm just going to skip over the rest of it there because of the solution. Can I just, for one moment, this is a bone I need to pick, and it's on the show.
Yeah.
Continuous campaigning. What the fuck does that mean? This term just started to appear in the last, I don't know, maybe 2 years. Continuous campaigning. I don't know what that means.
Yep.
I mean, I know what it means.
You do.
We're just going to continuously campaign. But can as an organizer, can we please be a bit more specific? What exactly do you mean? Who's going to pay for it? What are you going to do? What does it look like? Like, we all know that if you just try and keep on rolling out the same, because an electoral strategy is fundamentally different to a strategy outside electoral cycle, because the thing that motivates folks is urgency, and the urgency is built on time. Time isn't there's 23 days to go to election. I cannot count it when knock on doors, make calls, right? That's going to build urgency. That doesn't work when it's 4 years to the election.
Yeah.
Because everyone's tried that, and they struggle, and I get it. It's hard. So continuous campaign, just giving it a frigging label isn't going to make something just appear, right? So what are we talking about here when we talk about continuous campaign?
We are actually talking about your favorite topic and mine, which is the ongoing investment and development of our people, to teach them how to organise in communities and to maintain strong relationships with communities and build upon those relationships to be leaders, to be community leaders. And this is this is something you and I have spoken about a lot, online and offline, right? We can't keep taking our own people for granted. And by that, I mean, first and foremost, those who are willing to contribute to the party, right? If they want to turn up, if they want to do stuff, we should help them be the best they can be, right? To borrow a phrase out of Paul Erickson, be the best they can be, to be able to kind of contribute in a really meaningful way. And that is about investing in development. Now, we should also stop pretending, right? And I'll probably freeballing a little bit here away from the review, but we should also stop pretending that everybody knows how to be a member of parliament, right? These are, teachers, nurses, community organisers, doctors, like people who come out of professional services, wherever they've come from. They could be shop floor, they could be blue collar workers, they could be, former consultants if you're a Liberal Party candidate. You know what I mean? Like these are people that come out. Hey,
failed police officers if you're
police officers, failed police officers, great police. These are people who come out of everywhere, right? And then we make them members of parliament, and you and I get them elected, and then we sort of we just walk away after the election as party officials, and we say, all right, good luck. Here are a couple of staff to manage, and I'm sure it'll all be fine, and we'll see you in the year leading up to the next election. I guess the kind of premise of this is to just say, let's all just cut each other a bit of slack. While there might be a handbook that says, here's the code of conduct and this is your job description, etc., this job is not easy. Being in politics is not easy. No one starts from a position of not wanting to do well or be good or be consistent with the values that they hold so deeply, right? So let's just give everyone a bit of a moment to kind of go, right, now let's give you some real good solid training around what it is to actually run teams, and what it, how it is to actually be a manager of staff, and what it means to be someone who's constantly engaging in your community and participating in your community, and then organizing your community in a way that serves, that sort of builds around kind of community issues and helps advocate to get good outcomes, right? Like to get good out, to improve local parks, to improve services, to contribute to a statewide or a national discussion about issues. Let's all just stop pretending that everybody actually knows how to do that. And let's get the people who do and help them train the people who don't necessarily know. And so, for the crux of this recommendation, it says go out and continuously campaign. But for me, in the delivery of it, it's like whatever it means for your jurisdiction, whatever barriers set up for you to be able to do that, break that barrier down. And I've spoken to you before about this, but it's sort of like, I did that in WA. So the WA Labor Party, we did that together. We looked at where the barriers were to investing in the development and building future leaders and future campaign leaders, in terms of building future members of parliament, running training sessions for people who were interested in becoming members of parliament and giving them an opportunity to get a bit of a sense of what that looks and feels like, so that they're more informed when they're making the decision about whether they should run or not. Like it's all of that sort of, whatever the barriers are to doing that, just go ahead and break those barriers down. That's not easy, right? But do it. That's the point of this recommendation. So if it's money, ask for it, go and fundraise. If you need, MPs to acknowledge that there is a need to help volunteers in their branches learn to better communicate, or be able to contribute by door knocking, then drive the outcome of having some training for those volunteers. Like the whatever the barrier is, break it down, get it done. And it's not easy. It's not an easy answer. It's not the same answer in every jurisdiction. But I guess the point of this recommendation is like, this is important, so just do it now.
I mean, as you unpack that, Linda, I agree with everything you've said, and the specifics you're going to are really, really important. And I'm sure that maybe further into the document that it does go to that, to the heart of that. Couple of challenges in achieving that. One of them is money, because parliamentary services can't. There is a limitation to what they can provide in terms of support for candidates. They can tell them how to be a parliamentarian, but they can't tell them how to be. Sorry, they can train them, not train them. They can show them how to do the job, right? The basic jobs of a parliamentarian, but they can't show them how to campaign. That's going to have to come up. That's going to come from the party, from the branches, and it's going to vary from branch to branch depending on their resources. But I can, talk about the Victorian branch, which is a cash-rich branch. We've got a lot of money. We're not struggling for cash, but we hold that cash for our campaign days, right? And we don't invest. We invest less in between election cycles to provide that support for those candidates or those organisers. We run it like a startup. We hire all these organisers, field organisers, historically 10 months out, but in the last campaign it got even later. And I wonder if that came up in the review. I don't know about that, if that was a thing. But we hire all these organisers, train them up. We win these elections, and then they lose their jobs and they just disappear into the ether. And so therefore the campaign ceases to be sustainable. If continuous campaigning is actually about is about sustainability in the way you campaign, then we have to solve that conundrum as well, right? About resourcing to support candidates, to support field organisers who then go and organise in these communities. I don't know if the review picked up on that or examined that, or certainly has then given some support to the National Secretariat to invest in those areas as well.
Oh, absolutely. And look, to the extent that you can, the reviews, and I always try to do, whenever I jump on a review, I always try to make it very clear. This is not the document that fixes all the problems, right? This is just the document that says, sure. And like, let's just be realistic about what you can and can't do through this process. Like, so through this process, we will reaffirm to you what we think is fundamental and important to success. Right? We will collate that. We will collate the good work that's been done, and a lot of it, as I said, cannot praise him enough. But Paul is really attuned to this stuff, right? And he's a sharp operator. He's fantastic. And so is Jen Light. And they get the investment that needs to happen in this space. So what this review will do, or has done, is provide for them a confirmation of what is critical to success, put it in paper and send it through. Now, that says you should have a national training, a national training program that invests in our organisers across the country. That says you should continue to engage the membership in a really meaningful way. That says you should continue investing in cold community engagement that does acknowledge and treat the cold community as several communities, not just one. It says that you should continue to focus on diversity of your candidates and of your branch structure and your volunteers and all of that, right? And it says do all of those things and allocate, but we can't write down in the recommendation, put $2.5 million to it over the next 4 years. But I think it requires a significant investment, and it requires our own leaders across the party to stand up and to say, we acknowledge and we accept that this is a fundamental part of what we need to do going forward. Let's sit down and nut out the practicalities of what we need to do to actually invest in it properly and do it well. And as I said, it's not an easy task, but all this review is trying to do is just reconfirm for people it is still the most important thing, or one of the most important things. Keep doing it. Knock down whatever the barriers are to overcome it. I appreciate it's complex. I appreciate there's a lot of sensitivity around, where does the money come from? Who are the people? Da da da. Like, I get it. We're in politics. There's politics of politics. No problems. But let's not ignore it and say, well, then that's too hard, right? It is a fundamental component of what we need to be doing. So sit down and nut out a plan for how you can get it done. Now, it's not unachievable. We have done it before. Being able to commit to it is not something we haven't ever done. It's just like it is entirely something that we are capable of. It is something that we have achieved in various jurisdictions. Let's just refresh it. Let's just relook at it. Let's just make sure we understand that it's still a critical part and go for it, right? And so whatever it is that needs to be done, however it is it could get done in the, really, appropriate, not breaking any rule, none of that, just sit down, work it out, make sure you invest in it. I guess it's easy. And that's the one thing I like about writing reviews is I could just say, this is important, over to you. But we've done it. You and I have done it. We've built that stuff. And you know as much as I do, where there's a barrier, you use your ability, your politics, your relationships, your networks, etc., to break that barrier down. So that's what we should do.
As you talk about that, it makes me think about I'm lucky enough in my job now with Dunn Street to be able to travel around parts of the world and work with social democratic parties outside of our wonderful country. And the question I constantly get asked is, because they're in that embryonic stage of trying to embrace elements of a field organising program or some form of community organising. And the challenges of within the parties is getting the people that hold the purse strings to release it to hire field staff or whatever it always comes down to money. And they sort of said to me, Stephen, how did you overcome that? And it made me go back and actually think about, well, how did I actually overcome that? I can't remember now. And you're right. Part of it is relationship building. It's about finding allies within the party and that's sitting down and having one-on-ones with them. And that was a lesson for me in that journey. I'm really going off topic here, but I think it's worth just unpacking for going forward. Going and meeting with people that historically probably, wouldn't have been on my side of the party, factionally. And just that was a lesson for me to say, Stephen, fuck that shit. Just if you want to win election campaigns, it doesn't matter whether they're from the left or the right. Like, just find people who share your interests in trying to build a people-powered electoral campaign.
Yeah.
And working with them to then sit down with the people who held the purse strings. And it's weird me saying that because I was an assistant secretary. So I know there was inherent power that I had as well, limited in some ways. But, sitting in campaign committee meetings with a bunch of people who kind of got what we were trying to do and looking at the budget that I put up and said, do we really need to spend
Mm,
$900,000 on bunting?
mm,
That didn't come from me. That came from someone else and went, if we can cut that to, whatever it was, that'll pay for 2 more organisers, right? 3 more
mm,
organisers. And everyone
mm,
went, yeah, let's just do that. Those
mm.
moments that I remember going, right, okay, now we're getting somewhere. And I
Yeah,
think that we need to continue to create those moments where we identify our shared interests in what we want to achieve. But that's in a campaign. This has to happen now because we're 3 years out,
totally.
2.5 years out, right? These
Yeah,
conversations
totally.
now, and then the strategic plans that you're talking about that can lead us to do the things that you want to say in terms of supporting our candidates and MPs,
Mm,
identifying those candidates that are out there right now that we're going, wouldn't mind putting my hand up, don't know how to do it, don't know what's
mm,
involved, like to get
mm,
trained. Let's use this because we don't have elections coming up for a while, right? This is the time
mm.
to start to build these foundations. Anyway,
Absolutely. And if you think about it, and of course, we started a conversation about the review, but you and I have ended in a conversation, like we've ended up in a conversation about organising. But of course, it always comes back to those real core principles of organising, right? Like so, um, and I go back to that experience of when I went over to Victoria in 2014, late 2014, and I was watching what you were doing there, and there was just some sort of like conventions that you were breaking down, and what resonated with me was some of the things you were doing was some of the things that I used to do when I was in seats, right? So share strategy, which is an important important thing to do, like bring people in, talk to each other about what you're working on, like have the respect of actually saying to someone, none of the stuff we're doing is magic voodoo, right? Like you could, as you said, the report's fully available online. Go through and read it, right? Like it's publicly available. Most of this stuff, organizing principles, the way you'd approach things, all of that, it's all very publicly available. You could do courses in it, right? So nothing that we have is real secret sauce, right? There's some pockets of it, but at the end of the day, everything is really available. So let's stop pretending that we're actually being respectful of some random convention, and actually let's break it down, open it up, and bring people in, right? And so what I saw you doing in 2014 was just that kind of like that core principle of share strategy, give people the tools they need to be able to perform really well, help them debrief and understand and learn how you can support their growth and development, be able to receive feedback about how you could be doing better too.
Mm.
um, Organize in a fashion that is driven towards some kind of key objectives, key outcomes. Be cognizant of community needs and community expectations, like real core stuff, right? Taking that model and applying it to how you structure a party or organize a party or organize ourselves to fundraise. It's all the same stuff. Build one-on-one relationships. Have it be values based. Make sure you're interacting regularly. Don't have everything just be an ask. Remember things that people tell you. Like
Yeah, yeah.
none of this is rocket science. It's just a little bit harder to do than I've made a decision, so everyone get on board.
And this shit, but Linda, this shit takes time, right? And
Yeah.
here's what I am worried about. This is what I'm
Mm,
starting to see. What we have, and when I mean the entire Labor Party across the country, we have got very good at mobilising.
mm,
And mobilising, as you know, is different to organising.
mm,
And so what we've got good at, so when you say to someone, what does field mean to you? They mean, that's knocking on doors and making calls. So that's what it's become. Organising in their mind has become knocking on doors
mm,
and making calls. And it's always in the last 8 weeks of the campaign. So
mm,
we've got good at mobilising supporters, whether they be party members or not, to go knock on doors and make calls in the last 8 weeks of the campaign. That's very transactional. And
yeah,
that will only last. And what's going to start to happen is if we keep on sending field organisers into these communities, late in the game, these volunteers and supporters are going to go, no, I've seen you before. I've seen your kind before.
mm,
We're not, organising is about building transformational relationships. Mobilizing, there's nothing wrong with mobilizing. It's a good thing. Mobilizing gives you
mm,
width, but
mm,
organising gives you depth.
mm,
And the organising has to take place and begin months out. Like I'm talking years out.
mm,
And it's those transformational relationships. It's the bedrock. It's the glue that binds our movement together. Once it becomes transformational, where we are, to your point, identifying people within our communities and saying to them, you don't get to self-select what you want to do. But what we are going to do is I'm going to develop you. I'm going to invest in you and your skills. I'm going to turn you into a leader, and we're going to work as a team, and we're going to grow the capacity of our campaign, and we're going to get closer to solving the problems in our community. That is organising. That's transformational. We're not. We that journey we begun, but we are nowhere near finishing that. And the party needs to start to do that. If we actually want to fix, people talk about the democracy of the party. How do we fix that? Organising fixes that.
That's right.
You know, and I think part of the problem is some of the people that hold the levers of power, now I'm starting to sound like Cornel West, don't want to give that up, you know, scared of that. And they shouldn't be. It's a good thing. We're not going to Corbynisation in our party, right? That's not going to happen.
Yeah.
But we need to be okay with saying to folks, hey, if we invest in you, then you're going to invest in this bigger movement of ours.
Yeah.
But it's a start today, and we need to do it through a particular strategy, and it's an organising program, and we're not doing that right now, and that's where we need to head. I
do think, though, there are pockets of really great examples around the place,
without a doubt.
And this is not just an opportunity to talk about how great Western Australia is. Again, I think during this review process and the various interviews we did in different jurisdictions, certainly New South Wales, across Victoria, across Queensland, when we talk to people at very senior levels of the party, and people with strong power bases and stuff, they are really awake to this, right? And there were such great examples, like members of parliament who, rather than feeling like COVID meant they shouldn't be engaging with their community and everyone just sort of stay sort of seated and in your home and don't go door knocking or do anything because everybody's like really nervous about people. There are members of parliament who really stepped up in service of their communities, right? They would contact all the community groups in their area who they already had really strong relationships with, and they would say, you service a bunch of people in your community. What do you need to continue keeping that connection strong? There were people who held online discussions about, health impacts or things to do, how to adjust to restrictions or, emerging challenges and how to address them. There were people who continued to engage on non-COVID related issues, just to keep, issues like education and transport matter and all of that sort of front and center, right? There was so many good pockets of like really great examples where people decided this is not just about going door knocking. The activity is not the thing. The actual thing is about building entrenched long-standing relationships within your communities and living in service of your community, right? Living as an advocate in service of your community. And there were excellent examples across the country where that occurred. What happened was, and there were people with the control over purse strings, like you say, those power bases who acknowledged it, invested in it, researched it, cared for it, paid attention, had conversations at the right time, did that all the right way. I think now it's about sort of watching all of that and hearing those people, and trying really desperately not to single out the wonderful conversations that I had, because I don't want to cause like World War III in a bunch of in a bunch of jurisdictions. But like, I could give you a list of 10 straight off the top of my head, but I feel like it would get too factional too quickly. So I met all of those people. I spoke to them all. We all had great conversations with them, and they were attuned to it, and they sort of went, "Oh, I've got to." They took, some of them took responsibility and said, "Like, I this is on me, and I'm going to make sure we do it better next time." And I would ask them the question, "Well, what do you need me? What do you need us, right, to put in this report that gives you the ability to kind of do something about it and lead up to the next one?" And they said, "Just put this in, and we'll do it." And there was people that just woke up to it, right? It also shone a light on the people who weren't, on those who weren't on board. And I think you could easily cut up a list, right? And you could go those who were on board versus those who weren't, right? And you could look at the margins, and you could look at the result, and you could look at the outcome, and you could go, well, I think those who were living in service of their communities, who were organising really well, who weren't just turning up at election day, who were deeply committed and passionate people that were in the local areas, that were supported by power bases in the party that had an eye to this stuff, they performed exceptionally well. And those who didn't, well, this report is about you.
Unbelievable. That's yes. You've summed up something that's been on my mind for some time, and I'm glad
Yeah.
that you've articulated that, particularly on this podcast as well. In our conversations, you've talked about COLD, and actually, for those folks out there that don't understand the acronym, I might get you to explain that in a moment. But I am conscious of that because I just find that certainly in my campaign experience, it is tokenistic. It's kind of like we need to do it, but once again, it's a question of resources. Like in the 2018 Vic campaign, we had 2 people doing cold organising or cold work, maybe 3 actually. But to your point earlier, they make up 50% of the voting population, yet 3 people are supposed to look after that huge voting base, whilst there's
Yeah.
like 16 media managers to take care of like 5 newspapers. Like, come on, there's something, like what's going on here, folks? So I just want to get your reflections on the recommendations really do hone in on this particular area that's so critical for our Labor base.
Yeah. I was truly impressed with the amount of work that the National Secretariat, so Paul and Jen, I think this was something that Jen took kind of carriage over, that the amount of work they put into this part of the campaign, in that it was like you've just reflected, like how many times have I said, oh, we just need a cold organizer sitting in a party of like that one person who's going to talk to all of these communities and all these different language groups and all of these
All
sort of
164.
yeah. It's
Yeah.
and it's easy to do, surely, like so. What was different at this election in 2022 was that there was some serious investment in language research and communications and distribution of information in different channels that you would usually non-traditional ones, so things that you wouldn't usually expect a serious campaign investment in. And I think that's a huge credit to the team that they invested so significantly there, to better understand the kind of sentiment and the issues that are driving people, and to then better be able to respond to those in line with our values and our platform and so on. And I think it's something that we should always continue to do, continue to grow. I think that what we really wanted to do as part of this review, kind of capture that as a really impressive thing, acknowledge that it had a significant impact in a whole host of communities. Like, the most obvious one at the time was the Chinese Australian community, and how significant that knowledge of the community sentiment played into being able to support our candidates, to really effectively kind of go out and communicate and engage, and the campaign to do so. The other thing that really mattered at this election was the diversity of our candidates, and not just from a gender perspective, but also from multicultural. And there's still a way to go in terms of being able to be more and truly representative of the broader Australian community. But just our, party's firm commitment to it and being very deliberate about it was just super impressive. And I think worth acknowledging, worth gathering, worth building upon, because it was a significant point of difference from previous election campaigns, as you and I have experienced in the past.
Anecdotally, I remember talking to one of our Chinese organisers for the 2019 campaign, and they were just saying the conversations on the doors and on the phones was that we were getting out organised by the libs around key messages. And the experience, certainly coming back anyway, from what I heard from similar people in 2022, was it was fundamentally, it had shifted. And then
Which is so impressive.
Yeah, I think we saw that again, even in the state campaigns, both here in Victoria and in New South Wales as well.
Yeah.
And I don't think we can underestimate the importance of that electorally. And also then what do we need to do? So what do we need to do to continue to develop those relationships in going to that transformational word, not transactional?
Yeah.
What do we need to do in that respect going forward, and set ourselves up for the next campaign to continue to bed in those communities that they see Labor as a democratic vehicle to improving their lives?
Look, it's more of what we've just been talking about that investment in community organising and local organising, right? building relationships that are meaningful, engaging people in a really respectful way, delivering on commitments, turning up, being present, and having MPs understand the significance of that and the importance of it and how critical it is to long-term planning is important. The other thing, and this is like to say it as bluntly as this, is stop treating people as like the only thing they care about is their language. You know, they have cares that are the same as everyday Australians around job security, future for their children, the investment in education, accessibility of services. What I found deeply fascinating in the kind of post-election research that we were doing, in which, and I will say that the National Office also invested in some in-language research and and research with multicultural communities to better understand, whether the fruits of the labour, if you will, like better understand how it played out within those communities as well. They were even more attuned to the downsides of Morrison's behaviour towards the end, the attitude and the arrogance of the government. They were more attuned to the impact of relationships in the global community, our reputation and our relationships in the Asia Pacific area. They're more attuned to the impact around that stuff from a supporting jobs and economic development in Australia point of view. They get that they get the connectedness of the global economy, and they get that plays a really significant role for the large and small businesses in Australia. And so, how many times have you seen? And let's talk about the worst of worst examples that it's just candidate thinks turning up and talking about cricket is the way to kind of do it. And there is an aspect of that, don't get me wrong, but actually there's also an aspect of understanding that if you've got a great leader, and we do, and Prime Minister Albanese just being very committed with Penny Wong and Don Farrell and others to building and rebuilding, resetting our global relationships and our positioning, that actually having that seen and recognised and being able to communicate that to certain multicultural communities across Australia will also make a really big difference in entrenching relationships and showing people we have respect for our partners, have respect for our neighbours, have respect for multicultural communities all in Australia and across the world, and treat people with respect and decency. These are core, core to community organising, core principles to community organising, as they would be for electoral benefit in future elections as well. So again, it just comes down to engaging directly, building meaningful relationships, and being very aware of their issues and how you respond to them.
Yeah, it's funny on election night when there was huge swings to Labor across the eastern suburbs of Melbourne, and people going, "Oh, why is this happening?" You go, "Well, Scott Morrison declared war on China."
Yeah.
And, and there's a huge growing Chinese population that votes, that are Australian citizens that live across the eastern suburbs of Melbourne. And I just don't think that they played that out and thought that through.
But more than that, right? People were afraid. Chinese Australians, like when in the research, right? They expressed some fear about their own security and personal security and safety, and the kind of rhetoric that was building up. Like, don't do that. Yeah. Like, that should be a core thing as a government, as a politician. Don't make someone feel more vulnerable. Don't put someone at risk. Like, have some respect. What you're saying, what you think you're doing at that level, right? What you say at that level reflects in a community. And you're giving permission to some sections of our community to behave like assholes to other sections of community. And don't do that. Like, how is that a thing we needed to collate and write down and make sure, like, hey, don't forget, don't be a fucking idiot.
Yeah.
Needs to be a kind of like a core thing that we need to keep reiterating. So, as I said, this investment in CUL community, culturally and linguistically diverse community, which is, as you know from census, more than 50% of the population, it's a big deal. And what Paul and Jen did was significant, and they should continue doing it. That's important.
Fantastic. Yeah. Now, look, I know we said at the top of the podcast, we've got to talk about the campaign review and the first 100 days, the first 365 days of the Albanese government. Clearly, we're not going to get to the second part. So that means we're going to have you back, Lenda, on the show to do that at some point in the future. But can I say thank you so much for your time today. I've really enjoyed this conversation. As a friend of mine, Ben Foster, would say, you're a phenom. That's what the young people say. I think that means you're a really good person. And
Great.
You're a great comrade. You've got great insights. I'm so glad that they had you on the review again for this campaign. I bet you this was a lot more fun than the 2019 one. I just really appreciate your insights and coming on the show. I know that every time you do come on the show, the feedback we get from our listeners has been nothing but positive. So thank you very much.
Awesome. I really appreciate it. Lots of mutual love and respect for you. And thank you as always for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to Socially Democratic. Did you like the podcast? Hit the follow or subscribe button and be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcast or Podchaser. And to get all the latest on Socially Democratic, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And we'll see you next Friday. Socially Democratic was brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. Maurice Blackburn Lawyers have spent more than a century paving the hard path to justice for everyday Australians. They've helped over 500,000 Australians turn their situation around, and they know how the system works. Their experience and skills means you'll get the best results possible. Find out more on their website, mauriceblackburn.com.au. Maurice Blackburn, experience you can count on. Socially Democratic was brought to you by SwiftFox. Every moment on a campaign matters. You need the tools that you can trust, lists that are up to date, phone banks that can change minds, emails that drive donations, events that will energise the community online and offline, and text blasts that distill your message perfectly. SwiftFox CRM is made for campaigners by campaigners. To find out more, go to swiftfoxcrm.com to win your next campaign.